Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. It's with great exasperation, as is always the case, that I ask the following question. What's new and exciting in your world this week, Anthony?
Well, it's exciting, but it's not new.
Here we go.
This is something that came out almost a year ago, January 2021. It's just coming to my attention, and it's worth mentioning. In January 2021, a TikTok user with Parkinson's posted a video expressing anger over how tiny are the pills for treating Parkinson's. The anger because, well, obviously, if you've got Parkinson's, it makes it difficult to pick up the tiny pills. So he makes a TikTok about this. Another TikTok user, Brian Aldridge, who coincidentally had taught himself how to use design and modeling software, saw the post and used his software to design a pill bottle that solved the problem. Problem was, though, Brian didn't have a 3D printer, so all he had was this design that he had produced. So he posts his design, he asks for people to test or improve on it. Within a couple of days, people with 3D printers had begun working on the project and started refining and tweaking it and making it better. In less than 2 weeks from the original post, someone had created a working prototype of this pill bottle. Mr. Aldridge subsequently got a patent attorney, but the patent itself he donated to the Michael J. Fox Foundation. This is an example of markets at work. Now, there was no exchange of money here, but there was an exchange of work for satisfaction. Most people would call it voluntary collaboration, but that, not the exchange of money. Voluntary collaboration is the core of a market. People come together, they voluntarily do things that are in their mutual benefit. The benefit doesn't have to be money. Now, consider if government had done this. First off, it wouldn't have done it for free. It would have been a multi-million-dollar line item somewhere on a budget. And it certainly wouldn't have been done in under 2 weeks. This would have been a multi-year project involving multiple bureaucracies and oversight. And I don't mean to poke fun at the government here, implying that it's incompetent. Rather,
It's incompetent. Come on, man.
No, that's not my point.
You know as well as I do that there would be a task force addressing this problem. 2 years after that task force first met, they would have their recommendation. A year after that, somebody would look and they'd say, that doesn't seem that good. Let's have a new task force.
Oh, yeah, and in the end, whatever it is they designed, if indeed they did design something, wouldn't work. But the problem there, I would argue, is not incompetence. Rather, it's that the government isn't designed to be a tool of innovation. It's designed to be a tool of force and planned organization. So it's good for things like establishing and maintaining a judicial system and enforcing the rule of law. But it's much less useful for things that require innovation and flexibility. And here to our rescue come the ever-vilified markets, that in the end really are simply groups of people coming together in voluntary collaboration.
I kind of like the attitude that everybody took.
The guy donated the patent to Michael J. Fox Foundation. He makes it open source. But even if he hadn't, if he'd said, okay, I'm going to keep this patent, I'm going to make money off it, okay, he would have made money. But the fact that people would be willing to pay him money indicates that they would value his pill bottle more than they value the dollars. So again, it would be an example of him providing value to the market.
And I can tell you, Ant, as an unhealthy, white, middle-aged male, that I'm on so many pills every day that I lost count months ago. If you could give me a pill bottle that would make it less of a pain, I would use it and be happy.
And that's the beauty of the thing. In a market environment, someone would have to bring a pill bottle to market that you valued more than you valued the dollars they're asking for. But when we ask the government to do it, what you'll get is a pill bottle that you may value or may not value, but it doesn't matter because you're going to pay for it anyway through the taxes.
I kind of hope that they capitalize on this a little bit. Good luck and God bless to you guys. Give us a call if you're within hearing distance of my voice. That's the kind of guest I'd like to have. Anyway, I'm going to quiz you a little bit, and I know how difficult this is for you. You almost always fail. And you almost always fail because you pay absolutely no attention to anything I say. I think that you're in league with my wife. Do you remember those days when Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris to be his vice presidential nominee?
Yes, I remember. I was astounded. There were so many better candidates out there.
Do you remember anything I said about Kamala Harris?
I don't recall your predictions. I just recall you being as astounded as I was.
My prediction, which has now officially come true, was that Kamala Harris would do absolutely nothing to grow the base, and it would be a stone hanging around Biden's neck. And don't you know, Ant, that's exactly what has happened. I'm looking at a story from the New York Post, which we'll put in the show notes for you. Headline: Kamala Harris sidelined amid growing tensions with Biden. Joe Biden is hanging on by a thread trying to get some of his domestic agenda passed, and he cannot count on his vice president to pave the road for him. Most of us have pretty good reason to dislike her. If you think it's a race thing, it isn't. It's a thing about her being the attorney general in California and seeing how she behaved with other people's lives in the balance. Biden picked her anyway. You and I both said this is going to be a marriage that neither of them wants. Not even 1 year into the Biden presidency, we're already seeing the cracks forming. And here's the interesting thing, Ant. This last week or so, all of a sudden, I'm hearing Pete Buttigieg's name being tossed around. And it's hard to toss it around, as I just proved. But all of a sudden, Kamala Harris is not the one who Biden sees as taking his slot later.
Being tossed around for vice president in the next election.
No, you just hear his name all of a sudden.
I see, as a party leader.
What's the last time you heard Mayor Pete's name? And all of a sudden you do. And you should always pay attention when a president says a guy's name over and over and over again. There's a reason for it. This brings us, of course, to the foolishness of the week. I often quiz you on this, too, to see if you've been paying attention to what foolish people are doing out there. I'm trying to figure out how I can say this without arousing fear and suspicion. Some company I work for, let's leave it at that. I work for lots of companies, but some company I work for mandated me to go take a sexual harassment online in-service training.
Okay.
It was 53 minutes, and every time you opened up a new browser window on top of it, it stopped.
Oh, wow.
It was difficult to get around, but luckily for me here, I have 3 monitors, so I could goof off on the other 2 when I was paying attention kind of to this one. And I was only kind of paying attention. It was one piece of nonsense after another. Everybody who's gone through this knows that this is box checking at its finest hour. But then, Ant, they finally got to the sexual harassment part. The presentation made it very clear that in order to be guilty of sexual harassment, nothing sexual needed to happen.
Really?
I want you to think about this for a minute. Sexual harassment is often sexual and harassment, but sometimes it's other things and harassment.
They give an example?
No, of course I can't. What the hell kind of example could anybody give? These are just words that people are throwing together in a blender. If you're the people who are in charge of telling us what sexual harassment is, and you tell people that it needn't be sexual, I mean, I'm just going to go home and read 1984 again.
Yeah, how am I supposed to deal with that?
Words have no meaning if that's the case.
Is the take-home from that one can be accused of sexual harassment regardless of what one does, for virtually any act whatsoever?
I think that's the takeaway.
That may at least be consistent, although I don't agree with it. It's consistent with this idea that what matters is the effect it had on me. And if I feel sexually harassed, it must be sexual harassment.
Yeah, I mean, that seems patently absurd.
Well, I'm surprised you didn't complain that having to take this survey made you feel sexually harassed. That would have been the end of it.
There are some ditches that we die in, and then there are other ditches. And this is the other kind of ditch. I try to teach people about this all the time when they say mask mandates are unconstitutional, blah, 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 blah. And I say things like, shouldn't you care more about the income tax? Isn't that more of a violation than being asked to wear a piece of paper over your mouth? There's a rank-ordered list here. Complaining about mandatory service training is so far down on the list I can't see it.
I wonder how much of this is simply the organization having to do certain things to protect itself legally. I can't recall ever having to go through training like that, but I've had other things, being in higher ed, these things come along from time to time. You have to do training in various things, sensitivity workshops or whatever it is. And when they do these things, and it's a faculty-wide mandate, everybody has to do this, they've said blatantly you can have 2 browsers open one containing the questions, the other containing the answers. Clearly, what's going on here is that somebody said, look, legally to cover ourselves, all the faculty have to do this, and then make it as easy as possible for them to check their boxes and be done. To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. This is our listener question episode. About every 6 months, we'll do one of these. We ask our listeners to send in questions, and if you didn't get the call to send in a question, that's because you either aren't on Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group, or a Patreon sponsor. Going forward, if questions arise, send us email, and we'll put it in our list of things to answer the next time we do one of these.
The little-known backstory here, Ant, is we do these when we run out of ideas, right?
Right.
We just got to throw open the queue, and people ask us questions, and we pretend like this was what we really meant. So where do you want to start?
We have a lot of questions, and these are in no particular order. Daniel from Mexico asks, why is deflation framed as a bad thing that we must avoid? There are some economists who say it's a bad thing. It's not something all economists will say. The more concerning thing is unexpected inflation or deflation. It's when it's unexpected that you can't plan for it and all of a sudden you're caught short. You're locked into contracts that you would have signed otherwise. The problem that some economists will say exists with deflation is that if prices are falling, people will put off buying things. So I'm not going to get a new refrigerator, even though I probably need one. Why? Because if I wait 6 months, they'll be 20% less than they are now. And so you could picture everybody just doing that and say, well, we're going to hold off on making purchases because prices will be lower in the future. And of course, that translates into less spending, which translates into less income for other people. The economy starts to slow down. That cycle only exists at the outset. That is when we first start adjusting to the deflation. Once you're used to the deflation, as long as it's constant, let's pick a number, let's say prices drop 5% a year, people adjust, and so spending gets back to normal. It's just all shifted backward a little bit. And I give you, as an example, one of the most vibrant markets is subject to massive deflation, has been subject to massive deflation for decades now, and that's the technology markets. Think about computers. Basically, a new computer will run you about $1,500. It doesn't matter whether it's 1990 or 2000 or 2010 or 2020. New computer, top of the line to middle, will run you about $1,500. What's different? What's different is that in each of those decades, the computers are way more powerful. In other words, when you think about it adjusted for quality, the price of a computer is dropping significantly. And yet, we don't worry about people not buying computers.
The same thing that applied to the computer you just talked about applies to your tablet, applies to your telephone, it even applies to your television.
Right.
I remember when I was young, I was a teenager, and we got our first 30-inch TV. Remember those?
Yeah.
It cost like $1,000. It was
That's right.
ridiculously expensive. And my father and I carried it into the house. It was so heavy. We got it up on the pedestal, barely escaping some sort of physical rupture. And about 5-6 months ago, I needed a new TV. And I went to the store and I bought one, and it cost me $500, $600.
Right.
So much, much less. And when you think about inflation over time, boy, this is near free compared to what it used to be. And it's 73, 75 inches. That's just fantastic.
And here's the thing. You don't delay buying the thing. We all understand if you wait and buy it next year, it's going to be cheaper still. But the fact is you want a television. You don't want to wait a year.
That's right. And if I'm going to wait, I'm going to wait until Black Friday. This is an interesting question, and it's probably very interesting for non-economists like me, because we talk about inflation, and that's all government fueled. That's government adding money to the money supply, thus inflation. Well, deflation is not them pulling money out.
Because they're not going to be pulling money out. Deflation tends to be the economy growing faster than the money supply. We're going to stretch the term inflation or deflation here, but where you see it most often is in technology areas.
Yeah.
Those things grow by leaps and bounds.
And a lot of economists, especially free market types like us, will say that the dollar has lost 90% of its purchasing power since 1950. Okay, but where's the evidence?
On average, that's correct. When you point to specific things, it's a mixed bag. There are some things that, relative to 1950, are more expensive. A lot of things are less expensive.
Well, yeah, but 90% is just ridiculous.
Things have changed so much since 1950. You can do the math and you can come up with this is how much the dollar is worth now versus then. But the fact is, what people bought then is markedly different than what they buy now. In a lot of ways, it's just not comparable.
I don't want to go back to 1950 with a 90% salary increase. And that's telling.
Yeah, and that, I think, is the good comparison. If you would not be willing to go back to 1950, doubling your salary, then clearly you're better off now.
And following that line of reasoning, there is literally no time that I would prefer to be living, except maybe in the future.
Except the future, right.
That was actually a really good question.
Jonathan Biggs asks, how do we know what level of foreign intervention is correct? For example, if the Holocaust were going on today, we certainly would want to intervene. But today, Uyghur Muslims are being held in concentration camps in China. Do these not call for our intervention?
Yeah, and here you see the political calculation on top of the moral calculation. Every one of us, I think, would say, of course, we should have gotten involved with the Holocaust in World War II. However, we didn't get involved with the Holocaust that resulted from Stalin's brutal rule of the Soviet Union. You can make a case that we didn't exactly know about it. And estimates there are at the low end of 20 million, the higher end 30 million. It never occurred to anybody that we should go and address that militarily. So you have to realize when you talk about these sorts of things, you're talking about politics as the art of the possible. Are you going to go to war if you know it's going to be long, drawn out? You're most likely to take terrible losses. This sort of thing just gets very gray. And if you think about the Soviet Union, you can think about China. Could we even hope to address it? Every now and then we thump our chests and we say things like, you have to behave better, but nobody believes it. With China, it's so strange because they buy our debt and they send us their products. We don't want to go to war with China. We never wanted to go to war with China.
Right.
Here's the reality that you're left with. We don't even go and address things like a Holocaust where it's in a third-rate African country that could never withstand an attack by the United States. Even there, we tend not to do it. What's the moral answer? Because what has to happen? Well, you go in, you cause a tremendous tumult, and then you never get to leave. I give you Afghanistan as an example. I give you Iraq as an example. And there wasn't anything going on there that even approached a Holocaust. I think you can make the case that the Kurds were experiencing one or were about to experience one in Iraq, but I think that's as close as we can get. It gets really muddy.
One of our listeners asks if we would talk a little bit about how the federal government measures certain things and how this has evolved over time. For example, measures of inflation, the consumer price index. What's interesting is we kind of make this up as we go along. We have the consumer price index. The way it evolved is we said, okay, we're going to look at things that the average person buys. And so we look at prices of things that the average person buys, and we say, okay, we're going to track these prices over time, and we'll create a weighted average that's weighted based on how much money the average person spends on these various things. So, for example, if the average person spends a lot of his money on housing or rent or whatever that is, then the price of housing or rent will figure larger in the calculations. Again, we make it up as we go along. And what we notice is as time goes by and certain prices start to get higher and higher, people will shift and they'll buy less of that and more of something else. So, for example, suppose it's the case that over time the price of steak gets higher and higher, and people say, okay, I'm just not buying steak anymore. I'm going to buy hamburger. And what happens is it's not a temporary thing of, well, I'm going to buy hamburger until the price of steak comes back down. It becomes kind of a permanent thing of this is now a change. And now you ask, well, what is it that people buy? Well, they don't buy steak anymore. They buy hamburger. So we need to take the price of steak out of the calculations and put the price of hamburger in. And when you do that, lo and behold, you get a different number. So we've evolved different sorts of indices that to a greater or lesser degree take account of these changes in how people consume things. We've also created a set of indices that selectively leave certain things out. For example, You might want to talk about inflation, but we understand that as the year goes by, in the summertime, the price of gas is higher, in the wintertime, it's lower, or the price of oil is higher in one time and lower in another time. Maybe we want to talk about inflation with the price of energy removed. So we have an index that talks about that. Or maybe you want to talk about inflation with the price of healthcare removed, and we have an index that talks about that. I say we make them up. I don't mean to say that they're imaginary, but rather we create them to serve whatever purpose it is that we have. We have a question about something, and so we create this index. And if it's an interesting index that seems useful, we'll track it over time. And before you know it, people start to use it.
When you said we replace steak with hamburger, chicken was a delicacy once upon a time in the United States. So when Roosevelt said a chicken in every pot, he was saying something very, very meaningful. It was more expensive than steak. And then look how cheap chicken has gotten.
Right.
When you're kind of poor, like I was a bunch of times, chicken is a godsend. That is the meat you can afford. You can think over the long term about the price of chicken in real dollars, and it's tanked.
You're talking about that, and it's reminding me of our poverty rate measure. Was it President Johnson who assigned to some staffer the problem of coming up with a poverty line? And this person just kind of looked around and said, well, poor people would buy the following things and they need this much money to do it, so that's the poverty line. And that became the number that everyone pointed to and said, if you earn less than this, you're poor. If you earn more than that, you're not. Dawn Patterson, one of the high school teachers that we visit often.
Hello, Dawn.
Asks about an article she ran across saying that State Street Global Advisors will need to ask permission to hire white men as they roll out their diversity hiring initiative. And I think you mentioned
Wasn't
something...
this the foolishness of the week?
Exactly. What are your thoughts on that?
It's beyond idiotic to say, let's not hire on any other metric than race.
Well, the question here is, and it's one I raised to you when you mentioned this earlier, isn't it discrimination? If the law says, look, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, and you say we have a policy now that says that we're going to make it harder to hire white people because they're white, according to the letter of the law, that's racial discrimination. And yet it seems that the courts don't treat it that way.
What you're looking at here is the reality that there are certain protected groups. When we say you cannot discriminate on racial grounds, we're really saying you can't do that to these people. If I'm running a company whose reason to exist is to make a profit, I'm hiring the best people I can find, regardless of race or gender. Now, you might be able to make a case to me that blacks and women over time in the United States have suffered all kinds of injustices. I think that's right. The real question to ask is, how do we best get past those? And I don't think racial set-asides are the correct answer. That's the answer that keeps us at each other's throats. I'll say this because I say this often. That is the preferred outcome to the civil rights industry. People who care about civil rights, on the other hand, think this is just beyond stupid.
You argued to me once many years ago that there was a time when the set-asides probably were necessary, that we had gone through a period where people were left out and we want to fix this to get the ball rolling.
I don't know what the correct answer is there. That's really, really complicated. People forget this, and I think they forget it with good reason. It hasn't been the case for over 150 years. But there was one group in this country that was brought here in chains. And I think that matters. Now, how much am I responsible for? I like to think nothing. I never enslaved anyone. Nonetheless, you see the problems that emerge. Now, I'm not willing to say that, yes, some sort of set-aside was the correct answer. What I am willing to say is that it made a lot more sense 100 years ago than it makes now. It might never, and I'm sympathetic to this, it might never have been the correct thing to do. But if it was, it's not the correct thing to do anymore.
Mike Balsamo asks, why hasn't anyone ever tried trickle-up economics, that is, cutting the bottom tax brackets by a larger amount than top ones?
You and I have answered this question many times. It's just never phrased in this way.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, trickle-up economics. The fact is, we do it. In fact, we've been doing it for a long time. We just don't call it tax cuts. We call it transfers. That is, the government giving money to people. If you look at the numbers, currently the bottom roughly 50 to 60% of Americans by income receive more money back from the federal government than they pay in. We've been hitting hard this idea of trickle-up economics, although no one's ever called it that. I really like the term. I'm going to start using it.
I do too. I think we should steal that. But remember, Ant, we've figured this out. The bottom, 60% in the United States pays no federal tax.
People will say things like, well, of course I pay federal tax. I pay my Social Security tax and all of this. Yeah, we understand that. Now, subtract out the earned income tax credit, subtract out housing subsidies, subtract out income support, all these various things the government does to help people out. And roughly 50+% of Americans are net recipients of federal government. They're getting more back than they're paying in.
The confusion always comes from the same place. They open up their check, they see all the withholding, and they say, look, I paid taxes. And yes, that's right, you did. You just got more back in the form of handouts than you ever paid in.
Yeah, and see, this is interesting the way they do it. You fill out your taxes, and there's a line for the earned income tax credit. And I say this because this is one of the big ones. And you fill it out, and it says at the end, well, you're going to be getting money back. You're going to get a tax refund. And people's minds are thinking, okay, I paid too much. I'm going to get some back. No. Do the math, and you're actually getting back more than you paid in. The earned income tax credit, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, pays people more money back than what they paid in to begin with.
And this is the sleight of hand that always comes with the income tax. We've got all kinds of politicians monkeying around with this. Withholding, I think, is one of the greatest evils perpetrated upon the American people.
I think so, yeah.
If we all had to write a check December 31st to pay for everything, I think you would see a lot more people complaining about all the things the federal government does.
Jordan Woodhams asks, in your opinion, what 3 taxes are moral and justified and should be kept in order to effectively run the government? What 3 taxes are moral and justified?
It's going to be a tough question, and I'm going to dodge it. It's not framed, I think, the right way. Could I come up with 3 taxes? Yeah, maybe. Maybe I can come up with 5. But really what we need to come up with is an amount.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Given that we have a goal, and that goal is to fund the government, well, then whatever funds the government to the level we want is going to be acceptable. To the masses, not to me. I think that we should probably, in total, pay about 15, 17, 20% tops. That's what I think you can make a very rational case for. I think you tick much over 20%, and you're into territory that I think is very, very difficult to stay in.
And let me say a little bit more there, because currently the government takes around 20%. The problem is it cheats by borrowing more on top of that.
But I want to throw another thing onto the fire here. The average American, by the time he's done, pays about 30% in taxes.
State, federal, local combined?
That's correct. And this is just from the Tax Foundation. And I think that you really do have to look at state, federal, local, the whole bit. I think it all matters. Even so, I'm between 15 and 20%. That would mean quite a lot less than we're now taxing people. And almost everybody I've ever asked comes in with that number too. I don't know why they're all drawn to the number, but they are. There might be some sort of natural resistance here.
You have said before when we've talked about taxes that you would put a carve out for the poor in the form of you pay 20%, but not on the first whatever, 10,000, 20,000.
Right. So I'm not in favor of a flat tax exactly. It's a graduated income tax with one split.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from there. I don't think I agree. I think it's important, particularly to the extent that government is this shared endeavor that we're all undertaking, that everybody be contributing. Even if it's the little kid with a paper route who earns $10, okay, 20 cents you got to send to the government. That's your contribution.
It would be $2, Ant, not 20 cents.
$2, right. Right, $2.
Nicely done, math boy. Anyway, when we talk about this and we dismiss my idea a little too easily, you miss one very important incentive. The incentive is for poor people to work. Any job they get to keep all the money. That's actually a powerful motivator. You usually end up on a black market to keep all the money that you've earned. The incentive that this brings around for rich as well as poor, nothing but salutary effects. We'll never know because nobody's ever going to do it. But boy, if you're looking for justice, this would provide it.
Along those lines, I like the idea of a consumption tax more and more than an income tax, because it seems to get at what people are talking about when they say things like, well, the idle rich, they aren't producing anything and they have all this wealth and they should pay more taxes. What's in people's heads is not somebody who's getting out there and working hard and producing something people want. What's in people's heads is some playboy who's, hanging out in his mansion, not doing anything. A consumption tax gets at that. An income tax is hitting the first guy, the guy who's out there trying to work. And so, too, with a poor person who's trying to get out there and work as hard as he can, don't tax his income. Now, you want to tax his consumption. The analogy of the carve-out there would be something like, okay, there's a consumption tax, no income tax, and the following things are exempt. Food, housing, maybe you want to limit it at some level or something, some basic transportation, so that you're helping that poor guy to live as best he can. He's not going to be taxed on the money he's earning, but any excess consumption, same as for everybody else, gets taxed.
What does that even mean, excess consumption?
And you see where the problem comes. And this is why every time we have this conversation, I end up saying things like I just said and then ending the conversation with, no, we need a flat tax. Because anytime you start drawing a line and say, well, we're going to exempt this, we're going to exempt that, that's how you end up with what we have now of thousands of pages of a tax code.
But you have to ask yourself, and I think it's reasonable to, are we going to have a consumption tax on things like automobiles and houses? Because, my God, that's going to mean you can't afford a house or a car. And when people get worked up down this line, when they really think that a consumption tax is good or useful, all you have to do is look at European VATs, the value-added tax,
sure,
that everybody has to pay on everything they sell. And do you have any idea what the average VAT rate is in Europe?
I think it's like 25%, isn't it?
Yeah, it's about 21. A number of countries are up around 27. So the real question here is, do you want to add 25% to the cost of every single thing you're going to buy? And then you see just how terrible this could be. And you start carving out exemptions. A certain kind of food for poor people. Well, not houses. Matter of fact, let's give you a credit for buying a house. Let's just leave cars alone. And before you know it, there's no way to think of this in any workable way. Is a flat tax workable? I think. But it would take political will that we haven't had in generations. That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we talk about the exact same thing.
Yes.
That we did this week, and we promised that we held some of the most scintillating questions for later, so you have no reason for not tuning in. Beyond that, you can follow us on Twitter. That's always fun. I think Twitter somehow makes people into morons.
It's trying to stuff your thoughts into 240 characters.
It's the interlocutors that I come up against there, but join us over there and make up your own minds. We'll be back 1 week hence on Wednesday at noon, just like always. And Ant, for crying out loud, this one's going out just for you. Be nice to people. And by people, I mean me.
All right, James.
See you next week, Ant.
See you next week, James.